Well, welcome everybody to episode 4 of Circle of Fellows. This is a monthly gathering of IABC Fellows to talk about a specific communications issue, and this month, crisis communication is on the docket, and we're very fortunate to have four, I should say, seasoned communicators when it comes to crisis communication, and we'll go round the table and introduce the four IABC Fellows who are with us this month, starting with, let's see, I'm just going to use my film strip and go left to right, so we'll start with Bob Berzak. Bob, I believe you are retired now from communication and doing some more charitable type of work, but during your tenure with Union Carbide, you were there for the Bhopal crisis, and as I recall, you were managing that crisis, weren't you? Can you talk about that for just a second and give us a little rundown on your background?
Well, initially, back in 1984, I was responsible for internal communications at Union Carbide, and subsequently, a few months later, became director of corporate communications, and followed through there until, well, till 1998, which is when I retired. And it's been good to be out of the corporate world, and very good to be in the volunteer side, and often find there's not quite as much crisis, but there is crisis in the nonprofit area as well.
Undoubtedly. Well, thanks for being with us, Bob. And moving on from left to right, we have George McGrath. George in New York. How you doing?
Very well, thanks, Shel.
And a little bit about your background for those who don't know you.
Well, I've been in the public relations business for, gosh, over 30 years now, and have done a lot of work on corporate crisis situations, environmental issues along the way, and also do a lot of work in issues management, which I think is the other side of crisis communications, because a lot of times a crisis develops out of an underlying issue that's been going on in an organization for a while. And an activist puts a spotlight on it, or a news media outlet puts a spotlight on it, and then you're scrambling to deal with it. So I think those two disciplines are very closely related.
Right, and we're going to talk about one of those crises that arose from an issue dealing with Amazon and the coverage they got in the New York Times a little bit later. George, you have your own agency there in New York, right?
I do, yes. I've reached that great stage in my career where I work with a nice short list of clients who are great people to work with. We have a lot of fun doing it. And I still have time to kick around and do things like this, which I enjoy.
Terrific. And next on my film strip is John Deveney from Deveney in New Orleans, but you're in New York.
I am, Shel. I am. The wonders of technology.
That's right. You can join these hangouts from anywhere in the world. So a little bit about your background, John.
Well, like George, I have a firm, and we have 3 main practice areas, and one practice area is specific to crisis.
And you've been involved in a number of them that are weather-related.
One of the many blessings of living in New Orleans, we had front row seats for both Hurricanes Katrina and Rita and the BP oil spill, and those were both projects that I worked on.
Terrific. And finally, Ann McCauley out of Reno, Nevada. Hi, Ann.
Good morning. Good morning.
And can you share some of your background?
Yes, my background is not on quite the scale that Bob and John and probably George have dealt with, but I've worked with a number of organizations, particularly in the senior housing market, on those kind of unexpected short-term kinds of things that pop up that people don't expect to be a crisis. So one of the things that I've learned in working with organizations over the years is that you need to anticipate more, because most of the clients that I've worked with in the last 10 years have been totally blindsided by things they never thought would happen. Dramatic, not on the scale of Katrina, but we've had, even in the senior market, things like murder-suicides and things like that, that even the best-run senior living community is very surprised by. And I've been in the communication industry a long time. I am recently arrived in Reno in the last 13 months, but I haven't retired. I'm working more with nonprofits today than I did before, and it's something I look forward to doing with my rest of my career. And like Bob, I think there's a lot to happen in nonprofits that also can create crises for them.
Oh, certainly. I mean, you look at some of the issues that the Red Cross has had to deal with in terms of questions about where contributions were going. And it's easy to see that a nonprofit can face the same degree of crisis as any for-profit organization.
Yes.
So let's dive into our conversation, starting with just an overview of the state of crisis communications. One of the things that I talk about when I'm addressing audiences on crisis communications is that the fundamentals really haven't changed, but the nature of crisis communication has changed largely because of digital and social media. And Bob, I'm going to start with you, although anybody jump in when you feel like it. The Bhopal crisis is become a textbook case in crisis communication, but there was no social media, and digital media was very nascent at the time. Can you talk a little bit about how you approached it then, and what you think would be the most significant change in the way you would approach it if you were there doing that today?
Well, back in 1984, as you say, there was no social media, but we did work with various types of media, from print and video. We worked every day. We had press conferences, and we videotaped each of those press conferences, and within 24 hours made sure that we got out copies of the videotape to television stations in the areas where Union Carbide was doing business, and to the plant sites and company sites. So we worked very strongly to get out video communications, as well as news bulletins, both to the plant locations and to the community as well. The main difference, I agree with you, Shel, that the fundamentals are still the same. You still have to focus on honesty and credibility. The difference today, I think, is that things move 1,000 times faster than they did back then. But the fundamentals are still the same.
One of the things I think that would have happened today in Bhopal, as we've seen in other crises, is that people on the ground would be sharing information. In 1984, for that to happen, somebody in the media would have to approach them and stick a microphone in their face, or come up to them with a notepad and distribute that through their media channels. But now with Twitter and YouTube and Instagram and all of these channels, you would be facing a lot of people on the ground sharing information. What kind of challenge do you think that might have presented in a situation like Bhopal?
Again, it would have been much more difficult, I think, in terms of coordinating a response on one hand, because there would have been many other players involved, both in the community there and elsewhere around the world. On the other hand, when I say it would have been a little more difficult to coordinate the response, social media works both ways, and so we would have had much more rapid access to information that we did not have at the time.
Yeah. John, with the Deepwater Horizon, you did have people on the ground. What kind of wrench did that throw into the planning for addressing that situation?
Shel, back to the question about when there wasn't digital and when there was, one thing that's fascinating is the two crises that I mentioned, Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil spill, happened just 5 years apart, 2005 and 2010. What's remarkable is how much society, communication, our tactics changed between 2005 and 2010. Suddenly, if our campaign for the BP oil spill, the response for the state of Louisiana and their Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism hadn't had very targeted, focused, discrete campaigns on all the different social media channels, there's no way the campaign would have been successful. There would have been a hole in the bucket because we wouldn't have been getting the message out. One thing that I think is fascinating about the change, and that it is a change between the real world and the digital world, there's two pieces of scholarly work. One looked at cancer and one looked at HIV and AIDS, so graver topics you wouldn't find. What they found is that in online credibility, people give no greater credibility to certified experts than they do to anonymous user-generated content. So even if the topic were cancer, you know, online we don't give more credibility to the oncologist than we do to the teenager who's, you know, pecking away at home. That really informed and educated our response plan for the BP oil spill, because we knew we couldn't just get accurate information and the right images out through traditional media. We also needed to create campaigns that allowed people to create user-generated content, and that content needed to be part of our response strategy.
So when you say that there's no more credibility assigned to an oncologist than to the teenager, you're talking about in terms of the weight people give to the content they're sharing, not necessarily to their authority. I'm thinking of the Edelman Trust Barometer that puts, you know, external subject matter experts at the top of the most credible person to pay attention to.
Well, and these two, and Edelman's study is fascinating. These two were scholarly research projects. One was HIV and AIDS and one was cancer. And what they found was, in the real world, where there's a huge gap, a significant difference between the credibility we would give to a radiologist or an oncologist or an infectious disease specialist and an anonymous person just typing in their opinion. What they found is online, the significant difference is not there.
I think we're finding out that something we learned back in 1984, that credibility is much more shaped by making emotional connections with the different audiences, whether they be internal or external, than necessarily dealing with the statement of facts on an ongoing basis.
One of the, as long as we're talking about who speaks during a crisis, I know, John, that during the Deepwater Horizon coverage, I learned this from Gerald Barron, who was involved in that through the Incident Command, the Coast Guard. There was a time, Gerald told me, when reporters were approaching people who were doing cleanup on the beaches and asking them how it was going, and the response was, "I'm not allowed to talk to you, you need to go talk to our media people." And the Coast Guard was subject to a lot of ridicule as a result of that. You can't tell me how it's going, you're right here doing it. And that led the Commandant of the Coast Guard to make a change to their media policy that said, if a reporter is asking you about something that is inside your area of expertise, feel free to answer. If it's outside your area of expertise, then please forward that to media relations so we can put the reporter in touch with the right person. But do you see more of that happening these days, where based on the credibility of the person on the ground doing the work, organizations are letting them speak during a crisis? Because, you know, you look at Edelman again, and CEOs and paid corporate spokespeople are pretty much at the bottom of the list of people trusted by the public.
Well, fortunately, we have lawyers to buoy them up. And
there must be a cat nearby.
And Sophie's got an opinion.
You know, one of the things that's so surprising about that, Shel, is the Coast Guard so often stands out for really managing media well. You know, they train their people appropriately, they take the right approach to sharing information, and that's manifest through their spokespeople. What you're seeing, though, is what organizations need to do, whether it's through their spokespeople or their media policy or whatever their communication is. The goal is, especially in a crisis, to make sure that the most accurate information is getting out there, and it's getting out through every channel consistently. You know, organizations have to be quick in their communication, and part of that is because they need to really establish that they are the go-to resource for information about their organization or about the situation. And you can't be that go-to resource if you're not credible. You need to make sure the information's accurate. And having people who are doing beach cleaning answer questions that could be outside of what do you got in the bag could be, the reason why the policy might have been there. But again, I'm surprised that the Coast Guard did that, because they're normally very buttoned up and professional about it. But just being concerned, I think BP will stand out as the single greatest litigation moment in human history so far.
Yeah, well, Volkswagen's on the horizon, and
talk
about that too. But George, do you see your clients or other organizations you pay attention to turning more towards subject matter experts during a crisis and less from spokespeople and leaders?
Well, I think you need to have, in any crisis situation, you need to have people speaking on your behalf who can explain what the situation's about credibly, and can talk about what the organization knows and very often what you don't know, but can also credibly talk to how we're going to get to the information we need to resolve the problem. And it's not always, there might have been a thought in the past, like we always kind of shove the CEO forward to speak on behalf of the organization, but I would say not always. You want to put the person forward who's, in a lot of times, closest to the issue, who knows it best and is best positioned to speak on it. And that could be I think it's, if it's a crisis involving your company, I think it's got to be somebody from the organization who does that. I don't know if I'd fob that off on an outside expert, although there's a role for those people clearly in helping to structure your communications and the messages you get out.
Do you see any, and I'll take this answer from any of you, do you see media training being expanded beyond the usual suspects in organizations for purposes of crisis communication, even in crisis planning, before the crisis happens? Do you see people getting trained on the belief that they might be called upon to lend an expert opinion?
Yes, I do. In fact, I advocate one way to not escalate a crisis is to keep the spokespersons at through normal communication channels. For example, when I was working with nursing homes when I was in Minnesota, but happened to be in Northern California, they had some real serious problems that today social media would have just totally wiped them out. But we struggled for about 3.5 years. But we coached people locally wherever we could to be able to speak to the issue, because the CEO of the company managing the nursing home was in Minneapolis, was not in Yuba City. And to me, that would escalate the issue to even a greater point if someone they don't know and have never heard from is all of a sudden the expert on an issue. So I'm very much in favor of keeping that, content experts where you can, and keeping the communication channels through as many of the normal channels as you can possibly use during an issue. And of course, that's something that has to be evaluated on an hourly basis sometimes, because you don't want the wrong person who can't be coached. And we did have a person involved in this process in Northern California who wasn't coachable, absolutely was not cooperative. So we had to look at an alternative, and in one case we did use a third-party spokesperson, which I have only used in that one instance.
We have a question that has come in from among the viewers. For the first time, I should note, we have turned on the Google Plus Hangouts on Air Q&A, so anybody who's watching live, if you have a question, please feel free to share it. You'll find it over on the right-hand side of the screen. And this comes from Brian Kilgore. I've known Brian, good heavens, 20 years? Longer? And Brian's in Toronto, and he says that one of the issues in this week's Canadian election was the Conservative government's gagging of almost all civil servants, including Canadian government scientists, forbidding them from talking to reporters. This is in direct relation to the conversation we've been having about employing your subject matter experts during a crisis. Not that an election is necessarily a crisis. It was a crisis for the Conservative government, as it turns out. But I think there's a difference between, training and turning to your people and then, issuing a gag order to your staff. Is that something you would ever advise? I'll throw that out to anybody.
Well, what that communicates is that you're not being transparent, that you're not open. That those are all the wrong things you want to signal during a crisis. You absolutely want to segment spokespeople, and you don't want your CEO, your highest official, to become the face of the crisis. You want to preserve the long-term value of your brand and of your organization's perception. So you need to have a deep bench of trained spokespeople. And one of the beauties of the spokesperson training is you get to see who can handle the rough and tumble of a crisis interview and who should really handle the good news.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Well, it also becomes very important that an organization understand you never want to have a response of no comment by either a spokesperson or by anybody related to the organization, which means it becomes incumbent upon the communications people to ensure that there are messages out there that anybody within the organization can turn to at very least.
I just want to tie this one up. Brian's followed up saying the anti-communications, non-transparent attitude caused the conservatives to well and truly lose the election. So the nail in Stephen Harper's coffin, I suspect. But this brings up an interesting point, and that is the conflict that arises during a crisis between legal teams and communication teams. We believe in transparency. We want to get a message out, and of course lawyers are there to avoid risk, and the easiest way to avoid risk is don't say anything. There was a study, it was done out of Oxford about 12 or 13 years ago. And they looked at public companies that had had crises, and they divided them into two different categories. There were those that responded accurately and quickly and transparently, and if the company was to blame for the crisis, they took responsibility for it and apologized. And then there were the organizations that I would characterize as having listened to their lawyers and either said no comment or deflected blame, and they looked at the earnings of those organizations, the share prices, and those that were transparent and took responsibility recovered their share prices faster than those that issued no comments, and in fact, at the end of the fiscal year in which the crisis happened, they had exceeded the share price from the day before the crisis happened, whereas the organizations that issued the no comments, not only didn't they recover as quickly, but they didn't recover by the end of the fiscal year, by and large, to the level that they had been at before the crisis hit. How do we deal with getting the message across to leaders in the organization that the legal concerns may exist, but you're probably going to come out of this better if you behave honestly and accurately and transparently and take responsibility? And I'll point out that Volkswagen, to their credit, when this thing came out, they immediately took accountability. They said, this is definitely something that we did, and we're owning up to it. And as heinous as what they did was, I have to commend them for coming right out and saying, yep, we did it.
Shel, it becomes important for the communications people to have good, strong relationships with the legal department well before there is any crisis. And you can't suddenly turn to build a relationship with the legal team when there is a crisis. Then it's too late.
Yeah, I think this is really about your values as an organization as well, and that's what really comes out in a crisis situation. You really get a feeling for the character of an organization and how they handle a crisis issue, respond to it, where they put their priorities on addressing the problem. I think it also, the discussion we're having also points out that while we all do a lot of war gaming and scenario planning for different crises, in today's digital world, you never know where something's going to come out and bite you. So you really need to have the relationships built in your organization so that you're in a state of readiness and that we've talked through these kinds of approaches inside our organization so that we know when this happens, we know we're going to put the priority on solving the problem or addressing the issue, and we're going to make that the top consideration. And likewise, we're going to have some understanding in terms of the legal ramifications of what we do and how far we can go in the communications. So all the more reason, as Bob pointed out, to have built those relationships and those understandings internally in the organization before one of these situations emerges. Because these days, once a crisis pops up on you, if it's in a digital age, we don't have that luxury of like, well, we got a 8 to 24-hour news cycle to figure out how to deal with this. It's instantaneous. And so we need to be in that constant ready mode as an organization to deal with these things.
One of the tactics that I'm seeing employed more and more is for an organization to go out, usually on Twitter, although that could change as platforms ascend, to say we're aware of this and are investigating. So rather than asking the reporter about the deadline or knowing that you have to have a statement ready for the 6 p.m. news or the evening edition, it's an instant acknowledgement that you know that this is going on. Is that something you all advise your clients to do?
Yes, I do, because you need to be, that's part of being transparent. And one of the discussions I usually generate, particularly coming in from a consultant side, and often the attorneys are not just corporate in-house counsel, there may be outside specialty counsel brought in on the legal side as well, as to talk about what's public knowledge anyway. You know, if you're involved in litigation or other kinds of things like that, you need to have a really candid conversation about what can a reporter go to the courthouse and get, and how much more damage will they do if you're not transparent and they're encouraged to go dig it out themselves. Because they are running on a 24-hour news cycle. They don't have time, but they will make the time if we don't provide the information. So, you know, I've run into that situation on occasion. I did go out on a limb once with the chainsaw cranked up behind me and ask an attorney who was being quite contrary if we could make a deal. I said, I promise not to practice law if you won't practice public relations. And I thought maybe our mutual client was going to have a stroke. He did not, and the attorney backed off. And I said, look, you know, this was involving a lawsuit. And I said, look, you know, the reporters can walk right across the street to the courthouse and pick up a copy of that lawsuit. Are there things in there you'd just as soon they not read? And that got his attention. I will say most of the attorneys I've worked with over the last 30 years or plus have not been that way. They have been cooperative. They do understand the ramifications, particularly today they understand the ramifications of anybody can tell the story. And as John says, everybody's equally credible in a digital environment.
I also think there's been a change in reality a bit that has helped our colleagues that provide legal counsel to shoe long. You know, I would say 15 years ago, 85 or 90% of the crisis business that came in, the phone call came from a law firm. Today, 85 or 90%, it comes from the CEO or someone at the C-suite, and it's surprisingly frequent that people on our team have to ask, do you have legal representation on this? And then we encourage that they get outside counsel for their legal needs. So that's a real sea change, and I think it's because business leaders recognize the power of information and the power of communication.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. Marianne, you were talking about the kind of information that journalists and others can just go to the courthouse and get. There's also information that isn't public or isn't public yet. There was a situation here in Southern California a couple of years ago where a commuter train crashed, and I think there were a couple of fatalities as a result of that. And the spokesperson for the commuter agency that ran the trains during the initial statement said it appears that the engineer of that train was texting at the time of the accident, and she was fired because she had disclosed something that, according to the agency, shouldn't be disclosed until the National Transportation Safety Board completed its investigation. That would be years down the road, and I have no doubt that if, in fact, the engineer had been texting, that would have come out long before the NTSB released its report. I personally felt that sharing credible information that they had when they had it was the right thing to do, and I felt really bad that she lost her job over that. Where do any of you come down on that situation?
I think it's important that there are clear roles and policies of who is authorized to share information, and the reason for those is, especially in a crisis, it's crucial that the most accurate information is being shared. It's dangerous. It can cause a lot of problems. It can even harm people if someone with out-of-date information, or maybe a majority of information, a little bit of opinion, is being shared as if it's gospel. So there are reasons to have, this is how information is going to be shared, and this is how we're going to vet it and make sure it's accurate.
Yeah, I've worked clients through a kind of a continual triage process that says who needs to know what and when and how much they need to know and who should deliver it. And you just repeat that over and over again until you determine how important a piece of information is. Because you're right, Shel, some of it is not public information, but it's credible, important information. And yes, I think it was wrong she got fired. I think perhaps she had not discussed with the crisis team who needs to know what and how much they need to know and who delivers it.
Yep.
That's a step that got missed, and it came back to bite her.
Yeah, of course, there was a train crash that put the lack of crisis planning on display much more recently in Philadelphia, where even the people who had been added to the customer service team to be able to take customer questions online were basically told stop answering questions after the crash. Of course, the questions they were getting was, when will service resume? How long am I going to be stuck here? Things like that, which leads to my next question. I see a lot of research that suggests that there are a woeful number of companies that don't do any crisis planning. They don't have a crisis plan, and an even significantly smaller percentage of organizations that drill the plan that they have. How important is a plan, and how important is it to routinely drill that plan?
Well, you know, plans are important. Just like, you know, the invasion plan for Omaha Beach was critical, and then when you got on the beach, everything changed. So plans are good to an extent, but I think it's more having a posture of readiness, being organized and sort of anticipating what could happen and how you would connect the right people in the organization to deal with it. So let's go back to the train crash example in Philadelphia. The kind of crisis planning that transportation companies need to consider in a digital age is the fact that if we have a train crash, it's not only going to be our people on the site gathering information. There's passengers on the train who are uploading stuff on Facebook. I've just been on a train crash. There was a congressman on that train who was in the accident, who walks off the train and starts talking to the TV crews who just showed up there. And we have to understand that this is the world we live in, where we don't totally control. We can't totally control this information, can't totally control the message, but we have to see the discussion that's going on and inject ourselves into it with the news and the information, the clarity we can bring to it. So I think it's more about, the training is more about getting our organizations and our people to understand the reality of this digital age we live in, and understanding that everybody's got their roles laid out so that when one of these things hits us suddenly, we can anticipate how it's going to play out in social, and we can deal with it and get the information to people to understand what we're doing to correct the problem, and very importantly, connect with the people who are important to actually resolving the issue.
Other thoughts? Yeah, my view is there's so many different ways to slice and dice categories of crises, but one way is to suggest that there's two types of crises. There's the ones that you can anticipate and the ones that you can't. So I think every airline out there probably has a crisis plan that dictates the steps that they'll follow should they lose an aircraft. And then there's a situation where something happened that you absolutely could not anticipate. And at the time of the Tylenol crisis, which is pretty well considered the archetype of good crisis communication, I think we see that through rose-colored glasses these days. But it is, studied in universities, and you still see articles that talk about it. Was that the drilling of the plan was based on getting people to abide by the company's values, and not jerk their knees and make all decisions based on sales and shareholder concerns. So they could have pulled the tainted or the potentially tainted product only from the Chicago area, where all of the tainted product had been discovered. They made a decision to pull it nationwide, which cost them a lot of sales, but their values said we put patients first. I think shareholders were fourth on the list. Employees and communities came before them. So how important is it to drill? Do you run the risk, if you don't practice your crisis plan, of jerking the knee and retreating to behaviors that may make sense in the heat of the moment, but will cause you damage down the road?
Yeah, I think you need to look at the process. I like to call my crisis plans really a process that you need to review on some kind of regular basis to say, are the processes we have in place valid? Will we be able to assess a situation going through these exercises, whether it's something we can anticipate or it's something that comes at us out of the blue? So you need to look at that. I don't advocate, for example, other than putting some kind of key titles, you don't identify in your plan who the spokespeople will be, because you don't know what's going to happen. You need a content expert, and you need you need legal advice, you need communications advice, you need content experts, and then you figure out who the names are in the org chart when you get to the issue. But you have a process to go through.
Right. That you've got a way really to get the right people into the room or online who can get you involved in understanding what's causing the problem and fix it, as well as communicate it. And it's going to vary depending on whether it's like a product contamination or product quality issue versus an accident or a plant emergency. The best kind of training and preparedness we've found is actually running executives through simulations where you take something like a product contamination situation and you run them through a day where it starts the way these things start, where you see a news report or something saying, hey, there's a consumer brought the product in and they found needles and pins in it. What's it all about? And the reporter's calling you for comment, or it's getting posted on Facebook. Hey, there's needles and pins found in our applesauce. And that is sort of I found the best training for executives, because it gets them to understand the issues that come up in these fast-moving situations, and the fact that at the end of the day, we've got to do the right thing by our consumers.
And it's important. No, go finish. I was just going to say that it's important to understand that one organization can have a hostile takeover attempt, and that might take place between bankers' hours, and yet another type of crisis might be the explosion at 2 a.m., so that you really do have to rely on the values, and when you do have simulations, don't be afraid to do it at 2 o'clock in the morning to see if pre-planned will work, or how it will work. If not, will it work?
Exactly.
Yeah, when we've gone into organizations on crisis management preparedness, in the old days, they say, we have a crisis manual and a playbook. And you say, that's great. Where is it? I don't know. It's back here somewhere. We'll find it. And they're blowing the dust off it, and they would have everything written out, like everything to do in every potential scenario. And we said, that's great if you can find the book. And what if you have the scenario that's not in the book?
Yeah.
And so I think maybe today we delude ourselves. We say, well, yes, I've got a digital crisis manual. You can access it on our internet. It's all there. And then the call you get in the emergency is about something else that you didn't anticipate in the book. So they've got limited utility.
Yeah, I recently had a client assignment to redo their crisis manual, and rather than address, here's what you do if this happens, it was a way to assess the degree of the crisis, to give it a numerical score, and at each level, I think it was 1 through 5, they were color-coded, you would determine that this is going to require that you have the crisis team available to the public during operating hours versus, say, 24 hours a day, and decisions like this. But it lent itself to dealing with something that you weren't expecting, to be able to make a quick assessment and decide what kind of team you needed to put together to do that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So
it's
I think there are
process.
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways to address a crisis. I'm going to share 2 completely different approaches that organizations took. One was Ford Motor Company, when they were faced with a lot of negative feedback. It was coming from the consumer population, not from the press at this point. What had happened was that their lawyers had sent a takedown notice to a guy who was running a discussion board for people who were just diehard fans of the Ford Ranger pickup truck. And they said, you've got to give us the domain and pay us $5,000 in damages, or we will come down on you with the full weight of the Ford legal department. And the guy went onto his site and said, man, I don't know what to do about this. I'm just trying to run a little site here for us fans. And all of the members of the group deluged Ford, and Scott Monty, who was running social media at the time at Ford, was getting flooded with tweets from friends saying, you better take a look at what's going on. So Scott tweeted, I think, if I remember the numbers right, 142 tweets during the day. So it was about every 10 minutes or so saying, I recognize this isn't good. I've called the legal department. I've set up a meeting with the legal department. I'm on my way to the meeting with the legal department. And there were points at which he issued some really salient information. They had determined that this guy was selling decals that were a trademark violation and things like this. And he asked for retweets. In fact, the first time he did that, it was the first time anybody in PR had ever asked for a retweet, so it made history. But the argument is that by continuing this flood of information, even when there wasn't anything new, people hung on for the next tweet rather than run out and start speculating or blogging about it. It really never made the trade press or the public press. On the flip side of that, you have Subway. On the day that Jared Fogle, their spokesman, pled guilty to child pornography charges, they issued one single statement saying that Subway had severed its relationship with Jared Fogle, and that was it. And I remember reading one commentary that said, oh, that's not nearly enough. They need to make donations to the organizations that deal with this sort of thing. And others that said this was perfect. I mean, what else is there to say after the organization says that they've severed that relationship? How do you make that determination? Is one right and is one wrong? Or how do you decide whether you're going to be out there like the CDC when there's a new flu strain saying we're aware of it, we'll be back every half hour to update you, versus here's our statement and we're done?
With the situation with Subway, part of it, and part of what they've done from the beginning, is try to make it perfectly clear that the actions and the criminal behavior of that Gerald committed had nothing to do with Subway and nothing to do with the organization. Sorry about that.
You see, it's a crisis.
Yeah.
I got to take this call.
Other thoughts on that?
I think you have to address each crisis, so to speak, on a case-by-case basis and see what, in the case of Subway, the one statement at that point might have been altered if there was a great uproar that went on, continued on. If that one statement held, then there would be no reason to go further at that point in time.
Danger is Subway suddenly owning an issue that is unrelated to their business or their activity, or and you know, some of the questions that came up were how much did the organization know, and there were accusations that one of the a female franchisee had even reached out to the organization with concerns about specific illegal activity that he had bragged to her about. So it was important for the organization to not suddenly grab the standard and be the bearer for anti-pedophilia.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful in these situations too, in terms of making contributions or things after an event that it comes across as you're trying to buy your way out of something. It's like the indicted hedge fund guy who's all of a sudden is very interested in taking disadvantaged kids out to the World Series games, but he's never done it before. Nobody's buying that.
George, you're absolutely right. One of the things that we always counsel clients is, in a crisis, you have to work within the existing norms and channels of communication and behavior that are already in place. If the CEO of the company has never come to your cubicle and suddenly she walks in and sits on the edge of the desk and says, "George, everything's okay, I just want to talk to you," you immediately think things are not okay, because that's not a norm of their behavior. It's not an existing channel. Going back to Shel shared several examples where organizations were alleged to have told employees to gag everyone and not to speak. It's a real challenge when an organization comes under crisis and they don't have a media policy that really manages and directs how information is vetted and shared with the public so it's accurate. If suddenly you're creating the media policy as the crisis is happening, it's a natural mistake that people are going to say that media policy is a gag order. It's one of those things, Shel, like you said, it's amazing the research that shows organizations that don't have a crisis response strategy or plan. It's also shocking that they don't have a media policy, that they're just kind of a Wild West approach to who can speak for the organization. But you have to do it before the crisis strikes, or else you're going to be gagging people.
I've also seen research that says that the organizations that experience crises that erupted in social media or because of social media, the overarching characteristic of those organizations is that they don't have social media policies in the organization and they haven't trained employees on how to use it. We've got about 12 minutes left, and I do want to get to that Amazon question, but we have another question that's come in from the audience, from Brian again, and I think this is a great one. He says, what's the role of the shareholder relations people in a public company's crisis? The U.S. has laws saying companies must concentrate on maximizing shareholder value. I know I have a view on this, but would like to hear from any of you with thoughts on the role of the shareholder relations, investor relations people.
Shareholder relations, certainly a member of the communications or a member of the crisis team. My understanding that an organization must disclose material information once it becomes clear that it is material and could move the nature of the stock market. But I'm not sure it has to disclose information whether it's going to be favorable or unfavorable to an organization. It's a question of materiality.
Again, I think we need to make sure that we're disclosing information, material or otherwise, about a crisis situation to everybody simultaneously, because otherwise, particularly the investor relations side, if investor relations is talking to some people about it but not others, it could be seen as selective disclosure. I mean, their role under the SEC regs is that they've got to disclose material information as soon as possible, and they can't just do it in one-off conversations with small groups. It's got to be a press release or other mass distribution. And then there's been discussion as to whether, Facebook postings or Twitter posts would count in that as well. But it goes to the point that all of the people involved with communications in an organization, with all these stakeholders, whether it's IR, whether it's the customer support organization, the customer relations group, the public relations organization, community relations, they've all got to be aligned with the messages that and information we're putting out in a crisis situation, because everybody these days sees everything. It's all out. All the audiences see everything. It's not like we can communicate individually with an investor audience or a consumer audience. Everybody's seeing everything, and they're seeing it instantaneously.
Yeah.
So
I think that's why.
I have a question for the panel because of at least my gray hair, for many things of which I'm not familiar. Does a tweet constitute public disclosure these days?
Well, I can tell you what the SEC has said. Reed Hastings, who's the CEO of Netflix, he makes material disclosures on his Facebook page, and he was being investigated by the SEC for this, or Netflix was, and finally they ended the investigation, and they said, look, Reed Hastings has made it clear to everybody that he does make material disclosures on his Facebook page, and therefore the people who need to know to follow him there, and therefore it is a legitimate channel. I think this started back when Jonathan Schwartz was the CEO at Sun Microsystems and had some prolonged conversations with Christopher Cox when he was the head of the SEC around, why do I have to issue a press release when everybody knows I blog and share information on my blog and it's publicly accessible to everybody? And Cox said, you know what, you're right. So what the SEC has basically said is, if the public knows that that is where you are issuing your statements, then that's fine. Anybody have a different understanding?
I think that's right.
Yeah, and yeah, I think it's also worth noting that there are different ways that you can look at the issue of shareholder value. You look at a company like Dow Corning, where they listened to their lawyers during the crisis created by the leaking silicon breast implants, and they never said anything. They never displayed any compassion for victims. They basically issued no comments, and they were fundamentally out of business because of their lost trust and credibility. Versus Johnson & Johnson with Tylenol, which seemed to be ignoring shareholder value by pulling product where there didn't seem to be a problem, but they came up with the whole concept of the safety seal. And when they reintroduced the product, they were the only ones to have a safety seal. And not only did their old customers come back, but customers of other product who felt more comfortable buying one with a safety seal started using Tylenol instead of the competition, and they got huge profits. So I think looking at shareholder value in the long term is not a bad thing, and should be done. But that short term thinking, we have to protect sales right now, can actually cost money in the long run.
I think a good example, Shel, is how Volkswagen is treating their situation today compared to what their sister company Audi did back in the 80s with what was reported by 60 Minutes to be a rapid acceleration problem. And Audi said, there's nothing wrong with the car. Well, there wasn't. They had a marketing problem. The accelerator and brake pedals were too close together, because in Europe, people tend to drive by rotating, keeping their foot in one place, rotating their ankle from the accelerator to brake pedal. In America, we pick up the foot and move it. So, and it took Audi out of the market for years in North America, because they said, it's not our fault, it's not our problem. They probably listened to the lawyers that time. I don't think Volkswagen listened to the lawyers this time.
They may have been listening to the lawyers, and the lawyers were in concert with the direction that Volkswagen went.
Yes.
Well, we got about 5 minutes left, and I do want to get to this Amazon issue. The New York Times ran a piece, almost sensationalistic piece, that took the company to task for the way it treats its warehouse employees, and there were a couple of interesting developments around that story. First, there was an employee not a corporate spokesperson, not working in PR, who ran a rather long item detailing the issues that he had with the story, and he posted that to Medium. That's the publishing service that has been really taking off, and they just got a multi-million-dollar round of investment. But more recently, Jay Carney, the former press secretary to President Obama, who's now working for Amazon, as the corporate spokesperson, took the New York Times to task. And I just read a piece this morning, in fact, that said, hey, Jay, you work in PR now, so act like it. They had an issue with his, rather than listing the factual inaccuracies in the story, blaming the small group of Amazon employees that the New York Times talked to. But then the executive editor of the New York Times came back with a response, and he published it to Medium. So we're seeing the rise of these third-party publishing platforms as the place where people are going with some of their crisis messaging. Good thing? Bad thing? Inevitable? What do you think?
Well, it depends on what kind of messaging you're putting out there. I don't think getting into a spitting match with the New York Times, which buys its ink or electrons by the barrel, is the most effective way to engage on that issue. But certainly using platforms, third-party platforms, to get your statement out there, or your information, or a fuller view of what you think the situation is, which is not reflected in media coverage or in other social media channels, sure, why not? If our role as corporate communicators in a crisis situation is to make sure all our key stakeholders have got the information they need to understand the crisis situation, how it affects them, what we're doing to fix it, and the working that through the news media is not the only channel to do it. We should publish all those things on our own platforms, on social platforms, and on third-party platforms.
And Shel, it also reminds me of a basic tenet in managing crises on digital platforms or in social media. You need to respond and address and manage the crisis on the channels it exists. It's not in your best interest to try and spread it out to other channels, but also if the discussion, if the commentary, if the disgruntled employees or customers, whatever the situation is existing on Facebook, and there's examples where people then create a YouTube video, and it doesn't get any leverage because everyone's on Facebook on the issue. So you want to keep it in the channels that it's in, but you also want to do that not just to contain it, because that's where the eyeballs are, the people that are interested on it, and if you are going to respond, you want them to see that you've responded. Certainly what you also want to do is, if it's an individual complaint, it's likely that you want to make a public comment saying, Mary Ann, thank you so much for sharing your concerns. Sorry to hear about your experience. And then invite her to take that discussion offline. You want to make that invitation public so people know that your organization has been responsive, that they're concerned, and that you want to speak to Mary Ann, and you want to move it offline as quickly as possible.
Yes, because Mary Ann's got a lot of opinions.
Yeah, I've seen some excellent examples of that, and I've seen some examples where it wasn't done. I'm thinking of the campaign against Nestle for its sourcing of palm oil out of the Indonesian rainforest on Nestle's Facebook page a few years back, where the guy who was responsible for the page took a rather arrogant attitude rather than inviting people to move the discussion elsewhere.
I think Domino's was a good example of how they used YouTube. Same channel.
Oh, are you talking about the two employees who?
Yeah.
Yeah, the video of them doing disgusting things with the food.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Well, look, the discussion we're having also points out another interesting reality about crisis communications today is that a lot of other people are going to pitch in on social media and discussing your issue. Yeah, there's going to be people who are upset with what you're doing, but you're going to have supporters pitching in. I've seen this with clients where there was like a product quality issue, and there's people commenting about it on Facebook saying, oh, this company doesn't care about their products, this stuff is lousy, they don't care about consumers. And the company's fans are jumping in saying, no, they're a great company. This is just an aberration. And you got to monitor those things and see how both sides are working. And if third parties are commenting on your behalf, just let them keep going. That's the best PR you can have.
Well, and hours of woefully. I'm sorry, Bob. Go ahead.
I was just going to. I'll come back to something that Marianne mentioned much earlier in the program. That you really need a process to deal with a crisis, but more so, you have to. From my perspective, is you have to deal with crisis, the concept of crisis, on a case-by-case basis. There is no formulaic approach, whether it be digital or print or video.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, an hour is a woefully short period of time to tackle a topic as deep as crisis communications, but it's all we've got. And I think the conversation has been great, so I want to thank you all for your participation. We're just at the hour mark. I'd like to go around very quickly and see if any of you have any concluding statements. Not that this is a presidential debate, but you know, the one key thing that you would want people who are watching this to take away from it, and we'll go the opposite direction of the introductions. Marianne, how about you first?
I think we didn't talk much about the employee audience because, as Bob just mentioned and George just mentioned, they can be your greatest ambassadors. So don't just look externally, look internally too.
Terrific, John.
You know, get your house in order before you have people come over, and that holds true with making sure that you have everything done. You have a deep bench of trained spokespeople that are prepared to respond and able to respond. You have a plan in place. You have a media policy so everyone knows how the most accurate information is going to flow as quickly as possible to everyone that needs it.
Great. George?
I think we should view crises as an opportunity to come out better than we went into it. It's an opportunity really to put your company's values in a crucible. And if you handle that situation right and show that first and foremost you care about taking care of people who are affected by the problem, whatever it takes, your corporate reputation and your brand is going to come out better from a crisis than when it went in.
Great. And Bob?
I would just go back to the notion that you have to be prepared today to respond as quickly as possible, and I'll say 1,000 times faster than might have been 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and to rely on individual instinct and trusting communications judgment rather than necessarily reaching for the book on the shelf that still has dust on it.
Right, if you can find it. Well, thanks, everybody. I've really enjoyed spending the hour with you, as I do in person as well. We'll be back next month in November with another Circle of Fellows on another deep dive into a communication topic. And till then, have a great month, everybody.
Thanks, Shel.
Thanks, Shel.
So long.
Thank
Bye.
you.